sponsored by the James Madison Council.
Hello, I'm Enrique Acevedo, correspondent for 60 Minutes Plus, the streaming edition of that Sunday tradition. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this National Book Festival lineup of incredible events, talking with authors about their work, about their writing, and of course, about the stories behind, the inspiration behind most of that work, or all of that work. We'll jump right into this timely conversation about immigration, two books that deal with this important topic of immigration from different perspectives. Well, actually, there are a lot of similarities, and we'll talk about that with the authors. And I welcome David Nassau, and please correct me if I'm mispronouncing your last name. David, of course, a professor, an accomplished author. It's a privilege to have you here and talk about The Last Million, a book that when you have to moderate a conversation about a book, you usually have the chance to read it, but it becomes like a homework. In this case, I thoroughly enjoyed both books. It was super helpful for my work and for ideas. And Sonia Shah, the author of The Next Great Migration. Thank you so much, Sonia, for being here today. And I'll start with a question for you, Sonia, because this concept that migration is part of our evolution as a species, animal or human, that it's in our nature. This idea of having to move to survive in many ways. I thought that was a fascinating approach to an issue that is charged with all this ideology and with all this politics around it, like immigration.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I started the book myself with this conventional understanding about migration as kind of automatically and reflexively a crisis of some kind. And I think that's that's sort of the conventional understanding that when people move, especially if they move in large numbers, that that is in and of itself a problem. We don't really look at whether the places they're going to have the capacity to absorb them. We don't look at whether the places they left behind might be made more resilient by their movement, and whether the migration itself is good for the migrants themselves. So those are all the questions we would want to ask to understand if a migratory flow is sort of a net positive or a net negative, or how disruptive it's going to be. But I think a lot of us kind of reflexively equate migration with crisis, but that's not what the science of migration is telling us. When we look at the role that migration has played in our own past, in our biology, and also in nature. Right now, about 80% of wild species are migrating into new places in sync with the changing climate. They're moving higher into higher latitudes. They're moving up, higher into the mountains. And this is widely understood as a really great thing because it means that we can conserve biodiversity into the future. And people are moving in new ways now too. We have more people on the move today than at any time since World War II. More people living outside of the countries of their birth. People are moving into new places in new ways and new directions. And the planet is changing really rapidly. So where the habitable parts of the landscape are shifting, and as a result, we're going to have to move in order to survive that. And so what I wanted to look at in this book is, how should we think about migration? Is it correct to think of migration as automatically a crisis, or is the science of migration in biology and in our past and in nature telling us something different, which is that migration is really an adaptive response to change? And if it is, then migration isn't the sort of automatic crisis. Maybe it's actually part of the solution. And could we look at migration in a new kind of way?
And you list a series of examples in which migration has been the solution for different species in different communities. But at some point, you also talk about a misunderstood history of immigration and even of ourselves as a species. And that's where I think the parallels can be drawn to David's book, because you, as a historian, David, you correct that history, especially when it comes to the Eastern Europeans, the last million that migrated, basically refugees. And it's an important distinction, right? Because when we talk about immigrants, it's not a concept that encapsulates refugees or asylum seekers as well. But tell me a little bit about the last million and the inspiration behind writing this book. And I'm also very interested in this the period you chose from the World Wars to the Cold War, David.
Yeah, I have learned as a historian and as a human being that we underestimate the suffering, the pain, the horror of war, of civil wars, of wars between nations. We Americans have come to believe, because wars are not fought on our soil, or have not been since the British burned down the White House in the Civil War, we've come to believe that when the hostilities cease, the sun shines, everyone smiles, and they go back to their normal lives. Well, that is not the case. Certainly is not the case as we see in Afghanistan today. It certainly was not the case after World War II. After World War II, there were millions of displaced persons, millions. Within months, the prisoners of war and many of the forced laborers from Western Europe who'd been brought into Germany to work went home. But 1 million were left behind, 1 million Eastern Europeans. President Roosevelt had believed, had understood that there would be millions of displaced people. And in 1943, he had brought together the nations of the world who were fighting against the Axis powers to plan for the post-war period. And those plans were made and a United Nations organization was set up. But the assumption was that everybody would want to go home again. Well, that was not the case. When World War II ended, there were 1 million refugees who either had no homes to return to, like the Jews, whose homelands had been devastated and were now occupied by a foreign power, like the Poles, or who had fought with the wrong side, collaborated with the Nazis, like tens of thousands of Latvians, Lithuanians, some Ukrainians and Estonians. They did not want to go home. And as a result, because there were no nations willing to take them, to accept them, they spent 3 to 5 years in the first mass refugee camps, which were called the displaced persons camps. The victors in the war were willing to shelter and to feed them, to send in doctors, but had no plans, no expectations that they would be allowed to resettle in nations other than their former homelands, which they refused to go back to. And as Sonia says in her book, the question that we have to answer is not why is there migration? The question is not why do people leave their birthplaces? The question is, why are we so afraid of these refugees? Why does fear conquer hope? Why do lies conquer truths? Why do certainly in this country, our elected officials not express the best of ourselves as Americans, which is a humanitarian instinct, and instead shut down our doors, our gates?
And I'll ask you both, have we always lived with this narrative this conflating of immigration with criminality and hardship, and even in the modern day area, terrorism, with this narrative of fear and hate. It seems we have accepted that even as a rite of passage. Well, the Italians went through it, then the Irish went through it. Now maybe Asian Americans have to go through it, or Latinos. Is it something that was born out of political rhetoric, or is it deeper than that, Sonia?
I was really surprised when I started looking into sort of the social science research around xenophobia. And I think we do conventionally understand xenophobic responses as sort of the default response, right? To when new people come in, like everyone gets alarmed and panicked and tries to keep them out. But in fact, in most places, people have been able to move across societies, across cultures, across borders when they've done that, and assimilated without really any conflict at all. So of course it's disruptive when people move, and and I think that has more to do with pace and scale and direction. But in most places, in fact, we do assimilate really well. And you can see that in our genetic structure, that shows that humans have been moving around and mixing with each other and going into new landscapes and new cultures continuously throughout our history, ever since we walked out of Africa. So, it's not actually true that we always have a xenophobic impulse. I think a lot of our current predicament is that there's certain peoples that we are okay with coming in, and there's certain peoples we are not okay with coming in. So it's really less about migration per se and more about who is migrating. So if you think about our treatment right now of Haitians at the US-Mexico border versus the Afghans who are coming over right now to be resettled versus people from Cuba who have been accepted in a totally, have a totally different political regime, a policy regime to accept them into this country. So I think it's partially that we struggle with xenophobic sentiment, but I think that it's used for political purposes because there's a lot of mobility that goes on, a lot of migration that goes on that we just take for granted. We don't even think about it. So we only look at a tiny, tiny fraction of migration. There's certain kinds of people who move and we look at them very closely, asylum seekers and refugees, but they are a tiny, tiny portion of like all the other migration that's going on within borders and across borders that we accept without, blinking an eye. It's like the blood in our veins. It's a circulation. We don't even notice it.
And do you think there's a natural reaction? I don't know if you were able through your research to see that in animal communities when a new member comes in, is there just a natural reaction to reject that, or is it less of a natural biological reaction than social?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, for a long time, biologists thought that, okay, every species has its own niche, in a habitat. And so if any other species comes in, then they're either going to have to steal a niche or they're going to die out, or they're going to have to destroy some other creature that has that niche to take over that niche. But what scientists have learned over the last few decades is that when new species move into a novel location, they actually start to fit in and create new niches. So when you have so-called introduced species, they actually add to biodiversity. So they're able to kind of fit in and create novel assemblages of different species together. So it isn't the case that it's a zero-sum game, that any landscape has a certain fixed number of spots. And so therefore there must be conflict when another species come in. In nature, species are moving around all the time. In fact, we're just learning about how much now because of things like GPS and solar technology. It allows scientists to tag animals and watch where they're going prospectively in real time over the course of their lifetimes, which never was, that was really impossible for, up until recently. And what they're finding is that most species are moving way more than we ever thought, way beyond the borders of the habitats that we thought that they stayed in, or the preserves or the zoos or the wildlife refuges that we set up for them. So I think just overall the picture is that there's a lot more mobility going on around us and in the past, and we've really underestimated the scale.
That's fascinating. And David, when you were answering the last question, I was thinking, have we learned those lessons? Did we learn the lessons of the last million, how they were displacing, in many ways forgotten? Um, did we, are we doing a better job of making sure that people who are displaced because of conflict, like it happened with that last million, are finding a place where they can thrive, a safe place they can call home? Or are we getting worse at this in our societies, especially Western societies, where we supposedly have these values of diversity and inclusion?
We claim to be a nation of immigrants. We claim to value diversity and inclusion. But as a historian, when one looks at our past, one sees two very different things. One, we try to keep people out. Two, when they come in, they become extraordinary gifts to the nation and to the people who are here. I mean, Sonia is absolutely right. You can go anywhere in this nation, and you can see in communities where Lithuanians or Somalis or Indians or other refugees and immigrants have settled, they have become a part of the fabric of life in those communities. That is not to say that there's absolute equality. There is not. But they become part of those communities. I mean, we can all tick off the areas in this country, the cities and the states, where immigrants have contributed enormous amounts. And yet we still, instead of looking at that part of our national history, we prefer to look at, to dwell in fears and to keep those gates closed. If you look at the history of the last million, it takes 5 years for the nations of this earth to welcome, to accept, to bring the last million to their shores. The United States of America is the last nation to accept part of this refugee population. But within 20 years, within 25 years, whether these Eastern Europeans went to Australia, the UK, Belgium, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, or the United States, they became part of their communities and part of their nations. Now, let me say one thing. The last million had an easier time, though they spent 3 to 5 years in displaced persons camps because they were European, because they were Caucasian, and because they were, for the most part, Christian, Protestants or Catholics with some Jews. They had a much easier time entering nations like the United States, Canada, and Australia than people of color do today. As a nation, we have put out the welcoming mat for Europeans and hidden it away for Asians, for Latinx people, for people of color from all over the world. And that remains the case today. I'm sorry to say. So have we learned the lesson of the last million? Have we learned that we as a people benefit by welcoming in these refugees? No, I don't think we have. I think we are continuing to base our refugee policy more on falsehood than on truth. We kept the Jews out of the United States in large part because numbers of congressmen and senators, Democrats from the South, Republicans from the Midwest, claimed that the Jewish refugees, because their homeland had been Poland, or because they had hidden from the Nazis, escaped the Nazis by migrating into the Soviet Union, because they were Polish by birth and had spent time in the Soviet Union, they were therefore subversives. They were communists, they were Bolsheviks, and we couldn't let them into this country. And that lie, that falsehood, was used to make refugee policy. And if we look at the current situation today, we will see that falsehoods about refugees bringing in disease, crime, drugs, etc., they are just as false, those claims, as the claim was that the Jews were Bolsheviks. So one thing we haven't learned is to base refugee and immigration policy on truth rather than falsehood, and hope rather than fear.
So I think we've established that biology, history, both science and experience point towards the benefits, the net benefits of migration. And even though we have these lessons from the past, even though we have this history, we have not been able to appreciate that and learn from those lessons. We still see this narrative of fear and hate and this conflation of immigration with everything we've talked about. I work with words just like you. I'm not as talented and gifted as you are as authors, but through our work with words, I think we also know how they can create realities. And a big reality around immigration in the United States has to do with the word illegal, human beings being illegal because they migrate. That entire, Sonia, narrative and rhetoric around immigration, how harmful it's been to our conversation and our public dialogue on an issue as important as immigration for this country.
I mean, I think it's incredibly toxic, and it's also, it also sort of belies this underlying ideology about migration, which is that migration is some kind of anomalous, disruptive behavior that's marginal, and it's like a tap that we can turn it off or on depending on what we want. We want a few more farm workers. Okay, turn the tap on. Okay, now we don't want them anymore. Turn the tap off. And I think what we are going to have to grapple with, especially in this era of a changing climate, is that migration is going to happen. And it is not something we can turn off or on. It is a life-saving adaptation to radical change of all kinds. And we can either manage it so that it's, we maximize the benefits and minimize the disruptions, or we can, try to trap people in places that are uninhabitable, which is what we're essentially doing now. And by doing that, we are guaranteeing that migration will be as disruptive as possible, because people are not going to stay in uninhabitable places for very long. Instead, you build up the pressure, and more pressure builds up to move, and then people have to move all at once in a panic, in a mass movement, without any kind of preparation before that. So what we can do now, because a lot of these climate disasters that are happening are slow onset, there's time that we can create legal pathways that are safe and dignified and humane, so that people can move to places that are more habitable, because that's going to ultimately be in all of our interests. But instead, we're trapped in this way of thinking about migration as something that we can just stop. So those people are illegal and these people are legal, and that there's this clear demarcation between the two. I think what we'll need to grapple with is that, in fact, migration is going to be part of the human experience in the coming years, as it has been in the past. And we can either make it really awful for all of us, or we can try to get the most out of it. It's not to say migration is not disruptive. it is disruptive. All change is disruptive, but we know that over the long course of history in the past, that the benefits definitely outweigh the risks.
Yeah, in regards to what you were mentioning on climate change, I remember a World Bank report back in 2017 that projected that by 2050, I'm not a big fan of projections that go on for decades. I rather look at history, but it said that by 2050 there'll be over 100 million people displaced because of climate change, and not just globally but also internally. And we've seen that in the United States in places like California with the wildfires, and Louisiana and Texas with the storms. More and more displaced people because of climate change. David, I also wanted to ask you about the images we're seeing. I guess as authors, you have the benefit of time and space in many ways to express yourself and to tell these stories, to share with us the history of immigration. But how do these images that we see of chaos, this narrative of border hysteria, of migrants, being chased by border patrol agents, how does that feed, or do you think it feeds this narrative of nativism and ethno-nationalism and the idea of having to militarize the border because there's a threat coming from outside? Are we dehumanizing migrants by using those images more than other sort of visuals to illustrate and document what's happening in places like the U.S.-Mexico border?
Absolutely. I mean, what we don't see is we don't see, how often do you see images of successful refugees or immigrants who have become part of the fabric of American life? We don't see that. We are shown images of human beings who have suffered and suffered and suffered on their journeys to try to make better lives for themselves and their children. And the suffering, the pain leads us to believe that these people are inferior, that there's something wrong with them, that they're animalistic, that they're less human than the rest of us because they're dirty, they're unwashed, they're fearful. You're absolutely right. I mean, we should not, the media should not forget to show us these horrors, but they have to be balanced. They have to be balanced. And we have to see the humanity that exists, and we have to cater to that humanity. And as I said again, we have to cater and we have to build our refugee policy on hope that these individuals and groups, once they're let into the country, are going to contribute. They're coming in not just for their sake, they're coming in for our sake. And if I could mention one other thing, we too often believe as nations, and certainly the United Nations has too often done that by simply putting refugees in camps and feeding them and giving them roofs over their heads, the flimsy roofs, we are fulfilling our duty towards them. But we're not. We're putting them in prisons. We're putting them in pens. We're putting them in zoos so the rest of us can look in and say, these poor people, they're different from the rest of us. So refugee camps is not the answer. And we have to stop relying on them, on encampments or organized camps as the way to deal with this problem.
And I wish more people had the chance to expose themselves to this material, to read these two books. I think our conversation about immigration would change radically if people looked at The Last Million and read The Next Great Migration. I think it's such invaluable work, and I again enjoyed it thoroughly, and had so many ideas about stories for 60 Minutes Plus coming from both books, and I really appreciate this conversation, David, Sonia. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us today. And again, if you know, this is such an important topic, it's a national conversation about immigration. The least we could do is educate ourselves more on the history of immigration, on the lessons we have to learn from the past, and on the science of immigration, which is a concept we never hear in this national dialogue around immigration. Thank you both. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.